It was at this juncture that Whimsy absented himself from the study with a murmured apology to the inspector, his attention having been captured by the arrival of Mrs. Constance Cairncross, widow of some 3 hours' duration, though one would scarcely have deduced as much from her appearance or demeanour. She presented herself in the drawing-room clad in a mourning dress of dove grey, not the funeral black of a woman recently bereaved, but rather the practical costume of a woman who had anticipated the necessity of entertaining official visitors and had dressed accordingly with an almost mathematical precision. Her eyes, when Whimsy entered the room, possessed that peculiar glassiness that suggested either profound shock or the administration of some mild sedative, a distinction which he found himself eager to clarify. She rose from her position upon a settee upholstered in that particularly aggressive shade of green which seemed to be the leitmotif of Ashford Lodge's aesthetic philosophy, extending a hand that trembled with what appeared to be genuine distress. Though Whimsy had encountered sufficient murderers in his career to recognize that trembling hands and downcast eyes were commodities available to the guilty and innocent alike. "Lord Peter," she said, her voice adopting that peculiar cultured inflection which middle-class women of a certain generation employ when addressing those whom they regard as their social superiors, "I confess I am utterly at a loss. Aldous was in such spirits last evening. We dined together at 8. Just the two of us, you understand. And yet this morning, when I brought him his tea at 9 o'clock, I found him in that dreadful condition. I simply cannot fathom how such a thing could have occurred." Whimsy settled himself into a chair with the deliberate care of a man preparing for an extended conversation, and his pale blue eyes, which possessed that unsettling quality of seeming to regard one with simultaneous amusement and penetrating analysis, fixed themselves upon her face with an intensity that caused her to adjust her position slightly and dab at her lips with a handkerchief that bore monogrammed initials in the corner. "My dear Mrs. Cairncross," Whimsy began, his tone adopting that particular blend of sympathy and detached intellectual curiosity that had over the years proven so remarkably effective in encouraging candour from the bereaved, "I wonder if you would be so good as to elaborate upon the circumstances of yesterday evening. You dined together, you say, at 8 o'clock, and might I inquire as to the nature of your husband's disposition during that meal? Was he perhaps troubled by matters of business or finance? Or did he exhibit any signs of the sort of melancholy that occasionally precedes the more extreme forms of human desperation?" The widow's fingers tightened upon her handkerchief, and a faint flush appeared upon her cheekbones, whether from indignation at the suggestion or from the involuntary physiological response to a lie, Whimsy could not yet determine. "Aldous was never a man of particularly sunny temperament," she replied, her voice assuming that quality of careful deliberation that indicated she was weighing each word with precision. "But last evening he seemed, if anything, rather pleased with himself. He had received some correspondence during the afternoon post, a letter, I believe, from London, and he spent considerable time in the study afterward, though he did not speak to me regarding its contents. We retired at our usual hour, which is to say at 10:30, and I did not see him again until this morning." Whimsy rose from his chair and crossed to the window, where he stood regarding the grey November afternoon with an expression of profound disinterest, though his mind was, in fact, engaged in a process of rapid and meticulous calculation. The letter from London, he reflected, would almost certainly prove to be of significance, and he made a mental note to examine the study's waste-bin with particular care. For men of a certain temperament, when disposing of incriminating correspondence, frequently burned it. Yet Whimsy had discovered that even the most thoroughly incinerated paper often left behind traces sufficient to permit reconstruction by someone possessed of patience and a modicum of chemical knowledge. "And the Evening Post," Whimsy inquired, without turning from his contemplation of the exterior landscape, "arrived at what hour, precisely? I ask, only because the domestic arrangements of a household such as this are necessarily governed by the schedules of the county postal services, which are, I understand, remarkably consistent in their timing." The widow hesitated for a moment, and Whimsy detected in that infinitesimal pause the presence of calculation. She was, he surmised, attempting to recall or perhaps to invent a plausible time frame that would correspond with the facts as she believed them to be known. "The post arrives at approximately 3:30, she said finally, "though I cannot claim to have observed the delivery myself, as I was engaged in correspondence of my own at that hour." It was precisely the sort of answer that an honest woman might provide, yet it was also precisely the sort of answer that a woman possessed of considerable forethought might carefully construct, and Whimsy found himself struck by the uncomfortable recognition that Mrs. Constance Cairncross bore all the hallmarks of an individual who had given considerable thought to the question of what she would say should anyone inquire into the events of the previous day. He turned from the window and fixed upon her a look of such benevolent understanding that she actually flinched, and he remarked in tones of studied casualness that he would of course require to examine the study's appointments with greater thoroughness, and that he hoped she would not find his inquiries unduly distressing. As he turned toward the door, he delivered what appeared to be an entirely peripheral observation. "I do trust that your husband maintained regular relations with his medical practitioner. One asks merely in passing, though the matter of his health might prove pertinent to understanding the psychological state that precipitated this tragic event." The question, delivered with such apparent casualness, produced an effect upon Mrs. Cairncross that was wholly disproportionate to its seeming innocuousness. Her complexion, which had hitherto maintained a respectable pallor, underwent a dramatic transformation, acquiring a greyish tint that suggested either the onset of physical illness or the precipitous arrival of acute anxiety. She opened her mouth as though to speak, then closed it again, her jaw working silently in the manner of a woman confronting some internal struggle of considerable magnitude. Whimsy, observing these phenomena with the detached interest of a naturalist examining the behavioral patterns of an unfamiliar species, settled himself back into the chair he had recently vacated and adopted an expression of benign patience, the sort that encourages confession through sheer inexorability, rather than through any overt form of interrogation. "Dr. Ashford attends us," Mrs. Cairncross said finally, her voice assuming a quality that was scarcely above a whisper. And yes, Aldous had been consulting with, rather frequently of late. A nervous complaint, nothing more, the sort of thing that men of business sometimes develop when they have been working excessively hard. Dr. Ashford prescribed a tonic and certain tablets for sleep, but there was nothing whatever, that would suggest he was contemplating anything of a self-destructive nature. The hesitation before the word nothing, and indeed the very vehemence with which she denied her husband's suicidal inclinations, struck Whimsy as possessing the quality of a woman protesting too insistently. Yet he refrained from pressing the matter further, having learned through extended experience that the most productive form of interrogation often involves the strategic deployment of silence and apparent indifference. He rose once more and made his way back to the study, where Inspector Maitland had been occupying himself with the apparently futile task of examining the deceased's correspondence. The body had been removed by this point, leaving the room with that peculiar emptiness that seems to characterize spaces recently vacated by death, as though some essential quality of vitality had been extracted along with the corpse itself. Whimsy directed his attention toward the waste bin beside the escritoire, which contained several items of interest. A theatre program from the previous week advertising a production of Macbeth at the Stratford Theatre, several pages of manuscript bearing what appeared to be financial calculations, and, most significantly, the charred remnants of what had once been a letter, partially consumed but not entirely destroyed by fire. The inspector, observing Whimsy's evident interest in this latter item, leaned forward with the eagerness of a man who believes he has finally been presented with a clue of genuine significance. "Burned the letter, did he?" Maitland ventured. "Suggests suicide. In my view, man disposing of his final messages before the act." Whimsy, however, was engaged in the delicate work of separating the ash-blackened fragments with the aid of a letter-opener and a pair of tweezers, revealing beneath the charring several words that, though incomplete, suggested a narrative considerably more complex than simple self-destruction. The letterhead, partially visible despite the damage, bore the imprint of a solicitor's office in Chancery Lane, and several fragments of text were sufficiently legible to suggest discussion of matters pertaining to inheritance, disputed claims, and certain financial irregularities. "You see, my dear Maitland," Wimsey remarked, his voice adopting that particular pedagogical tone that the inspector found simultaneously infuriating and enlightening. "A man contemplating suicide does not generally trouble himself to burn the correspondence that precipitated his decision. Rather, he leaves such documents prominently displayed, the better to ensure that his motivations are understood and his memory not forever blackened by accusations of madness or criminality. The very act of destruction suggests an individual concerned not with exculpation but with the elimination of evidence, a wholly different psychological enterprise, and one which rather militates against the theory that we are here confronted with a voluntary departure from this mortal coil." He carefully transferred the fragments into an envelope, which he pocketed with the satisfaction of a man who has recovered something of considerable value. The inspector, for his part, looked as though he were contemplating a career change to something less intellectually demanding, perhaps the management of a public house or the administration of a provincial railway station. Wimsey's attention then turned to the escritoire itself, upon the surface of which lay an appoint-me book bound in Morocco leather. He opened it and traced his finger along the entries for the preceding week, pausing at a notation dated 2 days prior. AC, 3 o'clock Thursday. Contingency. The entry was cryptic in the extreme, yet it bore all the hallmarks of a man recording an appointment of some significance, one which he deemed sufficiently important to be worthy of notation, yet sufficiently sensitive to require oblique reference rather than explicit documentation. "I should greatly appreciate," Wimsey said, closing the book with deliberate care, "an opportunity to interview the household, servants, particularly the housemaid who was responsible for attending to the study's maintenance. And might I also inquire as to whether anyone observed the postman's delivery yesterday afternoon? One seeks merely to establish the precise time at which this mysterious correspondence arrived, as such details often prove surprisingly germane to the establishment of chronological sequences." Maitland, who had been standing by the window with an expression of profound resignation, rallied himself sufficiently to dispatch a constable to summon the servants, and within the quarter hour Wimsey found himself seated in the morning-room in the presence of Miss Eleanor Hartley, the housemaid in question, a woman of perhaps 25 years with the sharp, intelligent features of someone who had spent considerable time observing the domestic arrangements of her employers, with an acuity that had evidently escaped the notice of both the police and the family itself. Her eyes, when she entered the room, possessed that particular quality of wariness that characterizes those who have learned through experience that candor in the presence of authority often results in consequences unpleasant and unforeseen. Yet when Wimsey addressed her with a courtesy and deference that seemed wholly incongruous with her social position, something within her countenance softened, and she began, with hesitant deliberation, to recount certain observations that would ultimately prove to possess far greater significance than anyone, least of all the young woman herself, could possibly have anticipated. "I've been with the Cairncross family for nearly 4 years, my lord," Miss Hartley began, her fingers twisting together in her lap with a nervous intensity that suggested she was acutely aware of the potential consequences of whatever she was about to divulge. "And in that time I've come to know the household's routines perhaps better than anyone, save perhaps Mr. Pettigrew, who is the butler. Mr. Cairncross, that is, the late Mr. Cairncross, was a man of very regular habits, which made the employment considerably easier, though not necessarily more pleasant, if you understand my meaning, sir." Wimsey inclined his head in an expression of sympathetic understanding, and the girl, emboldened by this tacit encouragement, continued with increasing fluency. "There was a gentleman who called upon him occasionally, usually in the afternoon when Mrs. Cairncross was occupied with her social obligations or her correspondence. They would closet themselves in the study for perhaps an hour, and I observed that Mr. Cairncross would seem rather agitated afterward, though he would compose himself before presenting himself to the rest of the household. The gentleman was of perhaps 60 years of age, distinguished in appearance, but there was something about his manner that seemed, well, I hardly know how to express it, commanding perhaps, or even threatening, though he never raised his voice. The precision with which Miss Hartley had observed these details suggested to Whimsy that she possessed an intelligence considerably superior to that which her station in life would ordinarily permit her to exercise, and he found himself struck by the characteristic unfairness of a social system that consigned such capabilities to the performance of domestic labor. "This gentleman," Whimsy inquired, his tone remaining one of casual interest rather than urgent investigation, did he possess any distinguishing characteristics, a particular accent perhaps, or mode of dress? And might you hazard a guess as to the approximate frequency of his visitations? Miss Hartley's brow furrowed in concentration, and she appeared to be ransacking her memory for details that had, until this moment, seemed wholly inconsequential. "He spoke with an accent that might have been Scottish," she said slowly, "or perhaps Northern English. I'm not entirely certain, as he spoke very little and very quietly. His dress was always immaculate, but there was something old-fashioned about it, as though he were a man of an earlier generation attempting to maintain standards that the contemporary world had largely abandoned. As for his visits, I would say they occurred perhaps once a month, though they became more frequent in recent weeks. The last time he called was on the Wednesday, yesterday, and it was at an unusual hour, nearly 5 o'clock, which was after the household had ordinarily completed its afternoon preparations. This last detail proved to be of considerable significance, and Whimsy's seemingly indolent posture underwent a subtle transformation, though only the most perceptive observer would have detected the sharpening of his attention. "And did you observe whether this gentleman remained long on the occasion of his most recent visit?" he inquired, his voice maintaining its tone of casual inquiry, even as his mind had begun to construct elaborate architectures of possibility and implication. "He remained perhaps 30 minutes, sir, though I could not say with absolute certainty, as I was occupied with my duties in the upper corridors. But I observed his departure, as it was necessary for me to descend the stairs to attend to the drawing-room fires. He seemed rather hurried as he left, and he did not bid anyone farewell, merely departed directly from the study into the hallway and out through the front door. Mr. Pettigrew was occupied with the pantry at that time, so it was I who observed his exit." Whimsy rose from his chair and conducted Miss Hartley to the study's window, where he gestured toward the drive below with the studied casualness of a man examining the architectural details of the exterior landscaping. "And this drive," he observed, "extends to the gates at some considerable distance, I should imagine. Are there any alternative routes by which a visitor might depart the premises? A path through the gardens, perhaps, or a gate leading to the adjacent property?" The housemaid's expression underwent a subtle transformation, as though some previously unconnected observations were suddenly cohering into a pattern of significance that she herself had not previously recognized. "There is a small gate at the eastern end of the garden, sir, near the conservatory. It opens onto a lane that leads toward the village. I've observed it used occasionally by the tradespersons and the gardeners, though the front drive is the customary route. But I've never seen Mr. Cairncross use it. It would have been a most unusual choice, given that it necessitates walking through the garden at an hour when one might easily be observed." Whimsy thanked Miss Hartley with a courtesy that seemed wholly disproportionate to her station, and requested that she remain available should further questions arise. As she departed, he stood regarding the study with an expression of concentrated contemplation, his mind visibly engaged in the process of reorganizing the vario. Facts and impressions he had accumulated into some coherent narrative. The poisoning theory, for he had by now become reasonably certain that the cause of death was not ballistic in nature, but rather chemical, was beginning to assume a shape that possessed a certain terrible logic. A man of nervous disposition, visited regularly by an individual of commanding presence, his correspondence with solicitors regarding inheritance and disputed claims, the careful disposal of incriminating evidence, the consumption of sleeping tablets prescribed by a medical practitioner. These elements, when assembled with proper attention to chronology and motivation, began to paint a portrait not of suicide, but of something far more calculated and deliberately orchestrated. He turned toward Inspector Maitland, who had been hovering in the doorway with the expression of a man gradually reconciling himself to the realization that the case was considerably more complex than his initial assessment had suggested, and remarked with characteristic understatement, "I rather think, Inspector, that our investigation has only just commenced. The question that now demands our attention is not who killed Mr. Aldous Cairncross, but rather the far more intricate matter of how and why such an individual was selected for elimination." The subsequent interview with Dr. Ashford proved to be an exercise in the delicate navigation of professional discretion and the demands of criminal investigation, a territory with which Wimsey had become thoroughly familiar through years of experience, in matters both legal and extra-legal. The physician, a man of perhaps 60 years, with the cultivated air of professional competence that seems to be instilled into those who have spent their careers in positions of trust and authority, received Wimsey in his consulting rooms in the High Street with a mixture of wariness and professional courtesy. His office bore all the conventional trappings of medical practice: glass-fronted cabinets containing pharmaceutical preparations, anatomical diagrams of a moderately gruesome nature, and that particular atmosphere of clinical detachment that characterizes spaces devoted to the amelioration of human suffering. Wimsey, upon being invited to sit, immediately directed his attention toward a particular shelf upon which several bottles of pharmaceutical preparations were arranged with meticulous precision, and his eyes lingered upon one particular specimen, a dark glass vessel bearing a label that indicated its contents were a preparation of chloral hydrate, a substance which he recognized as possessing certain properties that rendered it of considerable interest in the context of their present inquiry. "I understand, Dr. Ashford," Wimsey began, settling himself into the chair offered with the air of a man preparing for an extended conversation, "that the deceased Mr. Cairncross had been consulting with you regarding certain nervous complaints, and that you had prescribed for him both a tonic and certain preparations designed to facilitate sleep. Might I inquire as to the precise nature of these prescriptions, and more particularly, whether they were of the sort that might be obtained without undue difficulty by a person determined to acquire them through channels other than the legitimate medical profession?" The doctor's expression underwent a subtle hardening, and he adopted that particular tone of defensive formality that physicians invariably employ when their professional judgment is being called into question. "Mr. Cairncross was indeed a patient of mine," he replied carefully, "and he suffered from the sort of nervous exhaustion that frequently accompanies the strain of commercial enterprise. I prescribed nothing that was not wholly appropriate to his condition, and certainly nothing that would be regarded as dangerous or particularly potent. The sleeping draught was a mild preparation containing only the most conventional soporific agents. Yet Wimsey had observed something in the doctor's demeanor, a certain rigidity about the shoulders, a particular tightness about the lips, that suggested his ostensible candor was being exercised with considerable selectivity. And the chloral hydrate," Wimsey pursued, gesturing toward the shelf with a casualness that belied the intensity of his focus, "I observe you maintain a considerable supply. Is it your habit to dispense such preparations directly to patients, or do you rely upon the pharmacist for such matters?" The question, which might have seemed purely technical in nature, appeared to strike the doctor with the force of an accusation, and he rose from his chair with an abruptness that suggested considerable agitation. "I see no reason," he said stiffly, "to justify my pharmaceutical practices to an amateur investigator. If you have specific questions regarding Mr. Cairncross's medical condition, I suggest you consult with the coroner's office or present yourself with a warrant authorizing me to divulge confidential information regarding a patient." Wimsey accepted this rebuff with equanimity and rose to depart with a courteous incline of the head, yet as he reached the door he paused, as though some entirely peripheral thought had suddenly occurred to him. "One final matter, Doctor," he remarked, his tone suggesting that the inquiry was of purely academic interest. "I wonder whether you might have had occasion to prescribe similar preparations to any other patient who might share Mr. Cairncross's acquaintance. I ask only in passing. though the coincidence of medical care often proves suggestive of deeper connections. The doctor's face underwent a remarkable transformation, acquiring a pallor that suggested either violent emotion or the sudden recognition of a trap that had been laid with considerable subtlety. "I cannot discuss my other patients' medical histories," he said coldly, but his voice had lost its earlier authority, and Wimsey detected in his bearing the unmistakable signs of a man who had suddenly become aware that his position was considerably more precarious than he had hitherto imagined. Subsequent to this interview, Wimsey conducted a discreet inquiry with the local pharmacist, a taciturn individual named Weatherby, who maintained a shop that had been in operation for some 30 years and possessed the sort of detailed knowledge of the community's medical requirements that rendered him an invaluable source of information. It emerged, through a process of careful questioning disguised as casual conversation, that Dr. Ashford had indeed procured quantities of chloral hydrate that seemed somewhat excessive for his demonstrated patient population, and that these acquisitions had occurred with increasing frequency over the preceding 6 months. Moreover, and of considerably greater significance, one of the doctor's patients was a Mr. Nathaniel Cairncross, the brother of the deceased, who had been consulting with Dr. Ashford regarding certain chronic conditions that necessitated regular administration of sedative preparations. This revelation struck Wimsey with the force of a piece of a puzzle suddenly sliding into place, and he found himself seized by that particular exhilaration that accompanies the moment when disparate and seemingly inconsequential facts suddenly cohere into a pattern of terrible and undeniable logic. He withdrew to the local inn, the King's Head, where he had taken rooms, and spent the remainder of the evening engaged in the construction of elaborate timelines and the careful examination of the burned fragments of the solicitor's letter through a magnifying lens of considerable power, all the while turning over in his mind the various possible configurations of motive, method, and opportunity that the available evidence seemed to suggest. By the following morning, Wimsey had assembled sufficient information to warrant a more direct line of inquiry, and he presented himself at the residence of Mr. Nathaniel Cairncross with the casual air of a social acquaintance rather than an investigator engaged in the pursuit of criminal truth. The house, situated some 2 miles from Ashford Lodge upon the opposite side of the village, possessed a considerably more modest aspect than its counterpart, suggesting a disparity in fortune that might well prove illuminating regarding the question of motive. Mr. Nathaniel Cairncross received him in a morning room furnished with a sort of carefully curated economy that indicates reduced circumstances rather than deliberate aesthetic choice, and his appearance, a man of perhaps 55 years with the hollow-eyed expression of one who has been consuming sedative preparations with some regularity, suggested that whatever financial advantages his brother might have possessed, they had not been extended to him with any particular generosity. "My brother's death must have been a considerable shock," Wimsey remarked, settling himself into a chair with the ease of a man accustomed to conducting conversations of a sensitive nature. "Though I confess I have been endeavoring to piece together the precise nature of your relations with the deceased. I understand you have not been particularly close in recent years?" The observation, delivered with such apparent mildness, produced a reaction in Mr. Nathaniel Cairncross that was altogether out of proportion to its seeming innocuousness. His hands, which had hitherto been resting upon the arms of his chair with what appeared to be studied composure, suddenly clenched into fists, and his breathing assumed an irregular quality that suggested considerable emotional disturbance. "Aldous and I," he said, his voice acquiring a harsh quality it seemed to emerge from some deep reservoir of long-suppressed resentment, "have not been on civil terms for a period of some 15 years. Our father's will created a situation that Aldous deemed satisfactory, and I deemed unconscionable. He received the bulk of the estate, the house, the investments. I received the cottage on the estate and an annuity that, whilst theoretically adequate, has proven increasingly insufficient as inflation has diminished its real value. Aldous refused, on multiple occasions, to revisit the terms of the settlement, suggesting that I had only myself to blame for my reduced circumstances and that further financial assistance would merely encourage indolence." Wimsey listened to this recitation with every appearance of sympathetic attention, though his mind was engaged in a process of rapid mental calculation regarding the question of what might constitute a sufficient motive for the elimination of a brother who possessed both wealth and the power to remedy one's financial distress. "And yet," he observed, his tone remaining one of gentle inquiry, "I understand that certain events of recent date may have rendered the question of inheritance somewhat more complex than your brother's apparent indifference might have suggested. Matters pertaining to disputed claims, perhaps, or the discovery of some previously unknown beneficiary." The effect of this observation upon Mr. Nathaniel Cairncross was dramatic and unmistakable. He rose from his chair with such violence that it overturned behind him, and his face acquired a coloration that suggested either the onset of apoplexy or the overwhelming flow of emotion occasioned by the recognition that his carefully concealed secrets had been laid bare. "How did you—" he began, then stopped himself, seeming to recognize that any further utterance would constitute an admission of knowledge that ought not, under normal circumstances, to be accessible to him. Whimsy, observing this reaction with the detached interest of a man watching a particularly revealing theatrical performance, allowed the silence to extend for a period of some considerable duration before speaking again. "I perceive," he said quietly, "that there are certain matters regarding your brother's financial affairs that were not matters of general family knowledge. Might I inquire as to the source of your information regarding these disputed claims? The solicitor's correspondence, perhaps? Or did your brother, in a moment of confidence induced by alcohol or fatigue, reveal to you the existence of circumstances that rendered his position considerably more precarious than was generally understood?" Mr. Nathaniel Cairncross sank back into his chair, and his earlier defiance seemed to drain from him as water from a broken vessel. "Aldous received a letter," he said slowly, his voice assuming the quality of a confession wrung from an unwilling penitent, informing him that there existed a child, a daughter, born to our father some 40 years ago by a woman he had known before his marriage. The letter came from a solicitor in London, and it stated that the woman had recently died and that her daughter was prepared to contest the will on the grounds that she was the natural daughter of our father and therefore possessed a legitimate claim upon the estate. Aldous was beside himself with anxiety. The inheritance, which he had always regarded as his by divine right, was potentially threatened. He confided in me, I confess, in a moment of what I believed to be genuine distress, and together we examined the circumstances. The solicitor's letter suggested that the evidence was substantial, that the girl possessed documentation and witnesses, and that a legal challenge would almost certainly succeed, or at minimum would consume the estate in legal fees. "And this information," Whimsy continued, his voice maintaining its tone of gentle inquiry, "was communicated to you at what point precisely in the days preceding your brother's death?" Mr. Nathaniel Cairncross's hands had begun to tremble, and he reached toward a small table beside his chair where sat a glass containing what appeared to be a medicinal preparation of some sort. "On the Sunday," he replied, his voice scarcely above a whisper. "He came to me on the Sunday and told me everything. I thought, in that moment, that perhaps his own circumstances would be reduced, and that he might therefore be induced to settle upon me a sum sufficient to secure my own position. But he refused, as he had always refused. He said that if the legal challenge succeeded, we would all be impoverished equally, and that if it failed, the matter would be resolved and the estate would remain intact. He seemed almost resigned to the possibility of loss, which was unlike him entirely. And then, scarcely 2 days later, he was dead." Whimsy's departure from Mr. Nathaniel Cairncross's residence was marked by a certain abstraction of manner that suggested his mind was engaged in the process of assembling and reassembling the various elements of the puzzle with increasing urgency and focus. He drove himself back toward Ashford Lodge, but diverted his course at the last moment to conduct an interview with the solicitor whose letter had precipitated the entire chain of events that had culminated in Mr. Aldous Cairncross's untimely demise. The office of Messrs. Harrington and Harrington occupied a modest suite of rooms in a Victorian building near the railway station, and the senior partner, a Mr. Edmund Harrington, of perhaps 70 years of age, received Whimsy with the cautious politeness of a man accustomed to dealing with matters of considerable legal delicacy. Upon examination of the firm's files, which Whimsy obtained through the judicious application of authority and a certain appeal to the gravity of the criminal investigation, it emerged that the letter regarding the alleged illegitimate daughter of the elder Mr. Cairncross had been composed with considerable precision, and upon the basis of what appeared to be thoroughly documented evidence. The young woman in question, one Miss Catherine Ashford, had come forward with documentation purporting to establish her paternity, and the solicitor had been engaged to investigate the matter and determine whether a legal challenge to the existing will might be undertaken with reasonable prospect of success. The evidence was substantial, Mr. Harrington explained, his ancient fingers turning the pages of the file with meticulous care. Birth certificates, correspondence between your father and the young woman's mother, even certain financial records indicating that he had maintained a quarterly allowance for the child throughout her lifetime. The matter would have presented considerable difficulty for the estate, and I informed Mr. Aldous Cairncross, when he consulted with me following receipt of our letter, that the outcome of any legal proceeding would have been considerably uncertain. At minimum, the matter would have required substantial legal expenditure to resolve. Whimsy's attention, however, was focused upon a particular detail that appeared to have escaped the notice of the solicitor himself, the fact that the letter bearing the information regarding Miss Catherine Ashford had been composed upon the firm's stationery and bore the signature of Mr. Harrington's junior partner, a Mr. Thomas Harrington, who was indicated to be a son of the senior partner. "And might I inquire," Whimsy asked with characteristic mildness, "whether your son continues to maintain an active practice with the firm, or has he perhaps removed himself to other employment?" Mr. Harrington's expression underwent a subtle darkening, and he rose from his chair with some difficulty, moving toward a filing cabinet with the deliberate movements of an elderly man conserving his remaining energy. "My son," he said slowly, "terminated his association with this firm some 18 months ago. He took certain clients with him and established an independent practice in London. The matter caused considerable acrimony between us, I confess, though we have subsequently reconciled to some degree. Why do you inquire regarding Thomas?" Whimsy's response to this question was to request permission to examine the signature upon the letter in question, and upon comparison with other documents in the file, he observed with characteristic precision that the signature bore certain irregularities suggestive of careful imitation rather than authentic production. The senior Mr. Harrington, upon this revelation, underwent a transformation of countenance that suggested either the onset of profound shock or the uncomfortable recognition of a truth that he had perhaps unconsciously suspected but had refrained from acknowledging. "You are suggesting," he said slowly, his voice acquiring a quality of hollow disbelief, "that my own son composed this letter, that he fabricated the evidence regarding this supposed illegitimate daughter. But what possible motive could he possess for undertaking such a deception?" It was at this juncture that Whimsy elected to depart, having accumulated sufficient information to warrant a direct interview with the mysterious gentleman who had been observed visiting Mr. Cairncross at irregular intervals. Through discreet inquiry with the constabulary's records, it had emerged that a gentleman of Scottish or Northern English accent, matching the description provided by Miss Hartley, had been observed on several occasions in the vicinity of the village, and that he had maintained lodgings at the adjacent town under the name of Mr. Robert Crawford. Whimsy's investigation of Mr. Crawford's background proved to be remarkably illuminating. The gentleman was in fact one Robert Cairncross, a distant cousin of the deceased, whose financial circumstances had become increasingly precarious over the preceding decade, and whose association with certain unsavory individuals suggested a pattern of behavior consistent with the procurement of substances of a pharmaceutical nature through channels that were decidedly extra-legal in character. More significantly, it emerged that Mr. Robert Cairncross had maintained a long-standing association with Dr. Ashford, and that their connection appeared to extend beyond the ordinary bounds of professional medical practice into territory that suggested collaboration in matters of considerably greater complexity and moral ambiguity. By the evening of the second day subsequent to the death of Mr. Aldous Cairncross, Whimsy had assembled a narrative of such intricacy and terrible coherence that it required only the final confrontation to transform it from suspicion into certainty. He dispatched Inspector Maitland to secure the arrest of Dr. Ashford upon suspicion of administering deleterious substances with intent to cause harm, and he himself prepared for the peculiar theatricality that he had learned through experience to be the most effective instrument for forcing the guilty to acknowledge the inescapable logic of their own crimes. The final piece of the puzzle, the precise mechanism by which the murderer had transformed an apparent suicide into an actual homicide, had become apparent through a combination of chemical analysis, architectural observation, and a careful reconstruction of the temporal sequence of events that had preceded the discovery of the body. It was a solution that would require careful exposition, and Wimsey recognized that the moment of revelation approached with the inevitability of an approaching storm. It was precisely at 9:30 on the evening of the third day that Wimsey arranged for a gathering in the study of Ashford Lodge, summoning with careful courtesy those individuals whose presence he deemed essential to the clarification of the matter. Inspector Maitland arrived with Dr. Ashford, the latter's customary professional composure having been somewhat diminished by the indignity of arrest and the evident anxiety occasioned by his inability to comprehend the precise nature of the evidence that had prompted such an action. Mrs. Constance Cairncross presented herself in a dress of black silk that suggested either genuine mourning or a masterful performance of the sort, her composure maintained with the rigidity of one who has steeled herself against the possibility of unpleasant revelation. Mr. Nathaniel Cairncross attended in a state of visible agitation, his hands trembling and his eyes possessing that peculiar quality of a man who has begun to recognize the terrible implications of information he has already provided. Mr. Robert Cairncross had been brought in handcuffs by the constabulary, his earlier distinction of manner having been replaced by a sullen and defiant expression that suggested he had resigned himself to whatever consequences might attend upon the exposure of his crimes. Additionally, Wimsey had requested the attendance of young Thomas Harrington, the solicitor's son, who arrived with considerable reluctance and a countenance that suggested he was acutely aware of the precarious nature of his position. Wimsey stood before this assembled company with the measured composure of a man about to deliver a lecture upon some abstruse academic topic, and he began his exposition with characteristic attention to detail. "The death of Mr. Aldous Cairncross," he commenced, his voice adopting that particular pedagogical quality that seemed simultaneously to illuminate and to condescend, presented at first examination the appearance of suicide undertaken in circumstances of considerable despair. The body lay upon the escritoire, a pistol rested upon the blotter, the door was locked from within, and the key remained clasped in the deceased's hand, all elements consistent with the classical configuration of self-directed violence. Yet upon more careful examination, certain details emerged that seemed to militate against this seemingly obvious conclusion. The powder burns upon the victim's temple were inconsistent with the distance that would have been necessitated by the trajectory of the weapon. The rigidity of the hand suggested that the key had been placed there posthumously rather than clutch. During the moment of death, and the room itself bore the faint chemical odor of certain pharmaceutical preparations that seemed incongruent with the mechanism of ballistic trauma. He paused, allowing his pale eyes to traverse the assembled company, and he observed with evident satisfaction the manner in which certain individuals underwent perceptible alteration of countenance. "The truth of the matter," Wimsey continued, "is considerably more complex and considerably more calculated than simple suicide. The death of Mr. Aldous Cairncross was orchestrated through the collaboration of 3 separate individuals, each possessed of a distinct motive and a particular role in the execution of the crime. The mechanism employed was elegant in its simplicity, yet sufficiently complex to have deceived the initial investigation and to have resulted in the closure of the case upon the assumption of voluntary self-destruction. The murderer, or more accurately, the murderers, for this was a crime undertaken through collaborative effort, began their work some days prior to the actual moment of death, through the dissemination of information designed to induce in the victim a state of psychological distress and financial anxiety. At this point, Whimsy directed his attention toward young Mr. Thomas Harrington, whose face had assumed a pallor suggestive of acute internal distress. "Mr. Harrington," Whimsy observed with quiet precision, composed and dispatched a letter purporting to emanate from the offices of his father's firm, informing Mr. Aldous Cairncross of the existence of an illegitimate daughter and the consequent threat to the estate. This letter was fabricated. The supposed illegitimate daughter exists only in the realm of imagination, and the evidence purporting to support her claim was wholly without foundation. The purpose of this deception was to induce in Mr. Cairncross a state of anxiety sufficiently profound to render him vulnerable to the subsequent phase of the conspiracy. Mr. Harrington undertook this action not from any independent motivation, but rather at the instance and behest of his former associate, a gentleman of considerable cunning and unscrupulous disposition, who shall be identified in due course. Whimsy then turned his attention toward Dr. Ashford, and his expression assumed a quality of particular coldness. "Dr. Ashford," he continued, having been approached by this unknown individual, agreed to participate in the scheme through the provision of certain pharmaceutical materials and the utilization of his professional position to gain access to Mr. Cairncross's household at hours and under circumstances that would not excite suspicion. Beginning approximately 1 week prior to the date of death, Dr. Ashford, in collaboration with a third party, undertook the gradual administration to Mr. Cairncross of minute quantities of chloral hydrate, a substance which, when administered in carefully calculated doses, produces in the victim a progressive state of nervous exhaustion, insomnia, and psychological distress. The effect of this gradual poisoning was to weaken Mr. Cairncross's mental and physical constitution, rendering him increasingly susceptible to the psychological manipulation that was the ultimate objective of the conspiracy. He paused once more, and then directed his attention toward Mr. Robert Cairncross with an expression of such penetrating analysis that the gentleman in question appeared to shrink beneath the weight of that regard. Mr. Robert Cairncross, Whimsy stated with quiet deliberation, was the architect and prime mover of this entire conspiracy. His motive was financial desperation. He had incurred debts of a nature that rendered his position perilous, and his credit exhausted. He was aware, the fact that Mr. Aldous Cairncross, upon his death, would be succeeded in his estate by his brother, Mr. Nathaniel Cairncross, with whom Mr. Robert had maintained certain associations of a financial character. Mr. Robert Cairncross conceived the scheme of eliminating his cousin through circumstances that would appear to be suicide, thereby ensuring that the subsequent inheritance would pass to Mr. Nathaniel, who had agreed, under the impression that he was merely engaging in hypothetical discussion, to settle upon Mr. Robert Cairncross a substantial sum from the inherited estate in exchange for the elimination of the threat posed by the fictitious illegitimate daughter and her legal claim. The revelation thus far delivered appeared to have produced the effect upon the assembled company that Whimsy had anticipated, though the precise manifestation of that effect varied considerably depending upon the individual conscience and the degree of culpability involved. Mr. Nathaniel Cairncross had assumed an expression of such profound shock and denial that it seemed scarcely possible he could articulate any response whatsoever, his mouth opening and closing in the manner of a fish removed from water. Young Mr. Thomas Harrington had begun to perspire with considerable profusion, and his fingers had commenced a nervous fidgeting with the fabric of his waistcoat that suggested acute distress and a desperate desire to interpose some denial or explanation. Dr. Ashford, by contrast, maintained a posture of studied composure, though his knuckles had whitened visibly where his hands gripped the arms of his chair, and the muscles at the angle of his jaw worked with a rhythmic intensity that indicated considerable internal agitation. It was Mr. Robert Cairncross, however, who presented the most remarkable transformation. His earlier defiance had metamorphosed into something approaching theatrical resignation, and he regarded Whimsy with an expression that suggested a certain grim appreciation for the intellectual elegance of the deduction that had culminated in his exposure. "You're perceptive, Lord Peter," Mr. Robert Cairncross observed, his voice acquiring a quality of sardonic amusement that seemed wholly incongruous with the gravity of his situation. though I confess you have not yet articulated the precise mechanism by which the actual death was accomplished. The chloral hydrate weakened him, yes, rendered him vulnerable to psychological manipulation, yes, but how precisely did three men separated by circumstance and position manage to introduce a fatal dose into the body of a man who was becoming increasingly suspicious and increasingly cautious regarding his diet and his consumption of medicaments? Wimsey, who had been regarding the assembled company with an expression of patient attention, inclined his head in acknowledgement of this observation. "That," he replied with evident satisfaction, "is the truly elegant aspect of the conspiracy, and it is the element that demonstrates the considerable intellectual capacity of the prime mover and architect of the scheme. You see, gentlemen, and Mrs. Cairncross, the actual mechanism of death was not, in fact, the simple administration of poison through conventional channels. Rather, it involved a collaboration between Dr. Ashford and Mr. Robert Cairncross to create the appearance of suicide through circumstances that were, in fact, carefully orchestrated and deliberately contrived." Wimsey rose from his position and walked toward the window, where he gestured toward the evening landscape beyond, with the abstracted manner of a man whose attention was focused upon matters of considerably greater import than the external landscape. On the evening preceding his death, Wimsey continued, Mr. Robert Cairncross visited Mr. Cairncross at approximately 5 o'clock, as was his custom. On this occasion, however, he was not alone. He had been accompanied by an individual whom he introduced as a colleague from London, a purported investment advisor who wished to discuss certain financial strategies designed to mitigate the effects of the threatened legal challenge regarding the estate. This investment advisor was, in fact, a stage conjurer and illusionist of considerable skill, a man whose talents lay in the creation of misdirection and the manipulation of perception through theatrical artifice. During the course of the conversation, whilst Mr. Cairncross's attention was directed toward the papers that were being ostensibly reviewed, this individual administered to the victim a dose of chloral hydrate substantially larger than those which had been gradually introduced over the preceding days, but achieved in such fashion as to render the victim unaware of its administration. The effect of this revelation upon the assembled company was profound, and young Mr. Harrington actually rose from his chair with an exclamation of denial. "That is impossible!" he cried out, his voice acquiring a quality of near hysteria. The chloral hydrate would have been perceptible, the taste, the odor. Mr. Cairncross would have recognized it. But Wimsey raised a hand in a gesture of gentle correction. "Would he?" Wimsey inquired, his tone suggesting that the matter was considerably more complex than Mr. Harrington's understanding seemed to encompass. "The substance, when dissolved in alcohol, and I observed upon the escritoire a decanter of port, 3/4 consumed, becomes substantially less perceptible to the palate. Moreover, the shock produced by the introduction of papers ostensibly bearing upon his financial distress, combined with the psychological disturbance occasioned by the receding week of gradual chemical manipulation, rendered Mr. Cairncross's faculties considerably less acute than they ordinarily would have been. Within the hour, the chloral hydrate had rendered him insensible, though still technically alive and still capable of minimal responses to external stimulus. Wimsey then directed his attention toward the escritoire, upon which he placed the fragments of the burned letter that had been recovered from the waste bin. At approximately 8 o'clock that evening, he continued, Mrs. Cairncross, operating in full knowledge of the conspiracy and her designated role within it, brought to her husband his customary evening meal, which she had been instructed would be the final opportunity for ingestion of any substance whatsoever. She was informed that he had consumed a substantial quantity of port and had been discussing matters of considerable financial gravity with his visitors, and she was directed to leave him to rest, to lock the door from the outside and to retire to her own chambers, ensuring that no one disturbed him until the following morning. Mr. Robert Cairncross and his theatrical associate departed at approximately 8:30, leaving behind them a scene that was meticulously arranged to present the appearance of deliberate self-destruction. The locked door, the key clasped in the victim's hand, the pistol placed upon the blotter, all elements constructed with the care and precision of a theatrical set, designed to deceive an audience of investigators and officials. The articulation of this final element of whimsy's deduction produced an immediate and dramatic response from Mrs. Constance Cairncross, whose previously maintained composure underwent a sudden and catastrophic collapse. She rose from her chair with a violence that sent it overturning behind her, and her face acquired a coloration suggesting either the onset of acute physical illness, or the overwhelming eruption of emotions that had been carefully suppressed throughout the preceding hours of interrogation. "You cannot prove that I was party to this," she cried out, her voice acquiring a shrillness that seemed to strip away the veneer of civilized restraint that had characterized her earlier demeanor. "I knew nothing of the mechanism. I was merely instructed to lock the door and retire. I was told that it was merely a theatrical exercise designed to frighten him into accepting certain financial measures. I had no knowledge that the dosage would actually." Her utterance trailed into incoherence, and she sank back into her chair with the manner of a marionette whose strings had suddenly been severed. Inspector Maitland, observing this collapse with evident satisfaction, rose from his position and approached Mrs. Cairncross with the ritualistic formality that characterized the arrest procedures of the constabulary. "Mrs. Constance Cairncross," he intoned, his voice assuming that particular quality of official solemnity that accompanies the enunciation of capital charges, "I must inform you that you are under arrest upon suspicion of being an accessory before the fact to the unlawful killing of your husband, and that anything you may say will be taken down and may be used in evidence against you in a court of law." Yet it was not Mrs. Cairncross who responded to this pronouncement, but rather Mr. Nathaniel Cairncross, whose agitation had, by this point, reached such a pitch that he could no longer maintain even the pretense of composure. "I swear to you," he cried out, his voice acquiring a desperate quality that suggested the man was confronting the possibility of implication in the very crime he had unknowingly facilitated, "that I had no knowledge whatsoever of the actual mechanism. Mr. Robert A. assured me that if I merely consented to the arrangement regarding the settlement, he would ensure that the threat posed by the fictitious illegitimate daughter would be eliminated. I assumed he meant through legal maneuvering, through the discrediting of her claim." Whimsy observed this outburst with an expression that remained largely unchanged, though there appeared in his pale eyes a certain quality of sympathy that suggested his assessment of Mr. Nathaniel Cairncross's culpability might not be as severe as the letter of the law would ordinarily demand. "I rather suspect," Whimsy remarked, directing his observation toward Inspector Maitland with the air of a man offering a professional opinion regarding a matter of considerable delicacy, "that Mr. Nathaniel Cairncross labors under a considerable disadvantage in the matter of knowledge, and that his consent to the financial arrangement was indeed predicated upon assumptions substantially different from the actual configuration of events. His legal position, whilst undoubtedly compromised, is perhaps not so entirely without mitigation as the strictest interpretation of the law might suggest. A competent defense advocate would likely be able to establish that he was himself the victim of manipulation and deception undertaken by individuals of considerably greater cunning and moral flexibility." Dr. Ashford, observing the progressive collapse of the conspiracy and recognizing that the moment had arrived at which individual self-preservation demanded the abandonment of collective loyalty, determined to undertake what he evidently regarded as a strategic retreat from the indefensible position in which he found himself. "I must state," he said, rising from his chair with a dignity that seemed scarcely diminished by his circumstances, "that I was engaged merely as a medical practitioner, administering substances at the action of Mr. Robert Cairncross, without full knowledge of the ultimate purpose to which those substances were intended to be employed. I understood that Mr. Cairncross wished to induce in his cousin a state of nervous exhaustion sufficient to render him amenable to certain business negotiations. I did not understand that death was the ultimate objective of the scheme. Moreover, I must emphasize that it was the theatrical artifice of Mr. Robert Cairncross and his unnamed associate that constituted the actual mechanism of death, not the gradual administration of chloral hydrate, which alone would have produced merely temporary insensibility, not fatality. Young Mr. Thomas Harrington, Observing the progressive deterioration of Dr. Ashford's position and recognizing that his own situation demanded immediate clarification and mitigation, also determined to sever himself from the conspiracy through the expedient of detailed confession. "I composed the letter," he admitted, his voice acquiring a hollow quality that suggested the man was experiencing the particular species of despair that attends upon the recognition of one's own fundamental weakness and susceptibility to the manipulations of more powerful personalities. But I was assured that it was merely a theatrical device designed to induce psychological distress, and that Mr. Robert Cairncross possessed entirely legitimate intentions regarding the subsequent business negotiations. I was not informed, I could not have conceived, that the ultimate objective was the elimination of my client through contrived circumstances designed to mimic suicide. I am guilty of participating in a deception, yes, but I am innocent of any knowledge regarding the actual perpetration of homicide. Yet it was Mr. Robert Cairncross himself who, throughout this progressive unraveling of the conspiracy, maintained the most remarkable equanimity and philosophical composure. He sat, regarding Whimsy, with an expression that suggested a certain dark appreciation for the intellectual rigor with which the deduction had been undertaken, and when at last Inspector Maitland approached him with the intention of placing him under arrest for the capital offence of murder, he rose from his chair with a courtesy that seemed scarcely dimmed by the gravity of his circumstances. "I confess to the charge," he remarked, his voice acquiring a quality of theatrical resignation that seemed entirely consistent with the nature of the crime. "Though I maintain that the ultimate mechanism of death was not my direct responsibility, but rather that of my associate, a gentleman whose identity I shall not divulge, as such revelation would serve no purpose beyond the destruction of a man whose only sin was a susceptibility to the persuasion of a more determined character than his own. The subsequent hours proved to be consumed in the tedious but necessary business of formal statements, the documentation of evidence, and the preliminary arrangements for the proceedings that would inevitably follow upon the exposure of the conspiracy. Inspector Maitland, having recovered from his initial astonishment at the complexity and elegance of the deduction, applied himself with considerable diligence to the task of coordinating the various elements of the investigation into a coherent narrative suitable for presentation to the prosecuting authorities. Whimsy, meanwhile, had withdrawn to the library of Ashford Lodge, where he occupied himself with the examination of certain documents that had been discovered in the study's concealed compartments, correspondence between Mr. Robert Cairncross and his unnamed theatrical associate, financial records indicating the precise extent of Mr. Robert's indebtedness, and certain letters from Dr. Ashford, that demon. Straighted the gradualism with which the physician had been drawn into participation in the scheme, beginning with seemingly innocent requests for pharmaceutical advice and progressing by incremental degrees toward the actual administration of deleterious substances. It was whilst engaged in this examination that Whimsy became aware of a certain lacuna in the narrative, a detail that, whilst not fundamentally altering the established facts regarding the commission of the crime, nevertheless possessed implications of considerable psychological and philosophical significance. The theatrical artifice employed to stage the suicide, the careful orchestration of circumstances designed to deceive the investigative apparatus, the meticulous planning that had characterized every element of the conspiracy. All these elements suggested a criminal mind of unusual sophistication and unusual restraint. Most murderers, Whimsy reflected, betray themselves through an excess of elaboration, through the incorporation of unnecessarily complex mechanisms when simpler methods would suffice. Yet Mr. Robert Cairncross, despite his evident desperation and his willingness to countenance the elimination of his cousin, had eschewed crude and direct approaches that might have served his purposes with considerably less risk of exposure. Instead, he had constructed an elaborate apparatus of deception that revealed, in its very complexity, a certain aesthetic appreciation for the craft of murder, a recognition that the commission of the perfect crime possessed value independent of its practical utility. This observation prompted Whimsy to conduct one final line of inquiry, which involved the discreet examination of theatrical records and the consultation of certain individuals within the entertainment profession who possessed knowledge regarding the movements and activities of stage performers of Unus. UL skill. It emerged through this investigation that the unnamed associate upon whom Mr. Robert Cairncross had relied for the theatrical elements of the conspiracy was indeed a man of considerable notoriety within certain circles, a gentleman known professionally as the Phantom, whose specialization lay in the creation of elaborate illusions and the manipulation of perception through the sophisticated deployment of misdirection and stagecraft. This individual had come to the attention of certain law enforcement authorities on previous occasions, though he had always managed to evade direct culpability through the expedient of remaining technically separate from the illegal activities he had facilitated. Yet, upon investigation, it became evident that the Phantom had recently departed these shores and had taken passage to the continent under an assumed name, thereby rendering the immediate prospect of his apprehension considerably more remote than might have been the case had he remained in residence. When Whimsy communicated this discovery to Inspector Maitland, the latter received the information with a degree of philosophical resignation that suggested the constabulary had come to accept that the absolute resolution of criminal matters frequently proved less satisfactory than the theoretical ideal. "At least we have the primary conspirators in custody," Maitland observed, with the air of a man consoling himself with the recognition that complete victory, though elusive, was not entirely beyond his reach. "The courts will make short work of them, and the sentence will be deterrent enough to discourage similar enterprises by other potential criminals." Yet Whimsy, returning to the window of the study where the matter had first begun to assume coherence, found himself contemplating the curious psychology that underlay the entire affair with a fascination that transcended the mere technical details of criminal method and prosecutorial procedure. The crime, as he reflected upon it in that concluding moment, bore all the hallmarks of a theatrical production, elaborate in its construction, sophisticated in its execution, yet ultimately predicated upon the exploitation of human weakness and the manipulation of circumstance. Mr. Robert Cairncross, driven to desperation by his financial circumstances, had recognized in the approaching inheritance crisis confronting his cousin an opportunity to achieve simultaneously the satisfaction of his own financial exigencies and the gratification of a deeper, more psychological desire, the desire to orchestrate an event of sufficient complexity and intellectual rigor to constitute an achievement worthy of his own considerable capabilities. In a certain perverse manner, the conspiracy represented an art form, and Mr. Robert Cairncross had approached its execution with the meticulous care of a master craftsman engaged in the production of his magnum opus. That this masterwork had necessitated the death of another human being seemed to trouble him far less than one might have anticipated, suggesting a disassociation from ordinary moral constraint that was perhaps more troubling in its implications than the mere commission of the crime itself. "I believe, Inspector," Whimsy remarked, turning from the window to regard Maitland with that characteristic expression of mingled amusement and detachment, "that we may regard this affair as essentially concluded. The guilty parties are in custody, the mechanism of the crime has been elucidated, and the evidence is sufficiently robust to withstand the scrutiny of the legal process. I shall, of course, be available to provide testimony should my presence be deemed necessary by the prosecuting authorities, though I confess I entertain some hope that my involvement in the matter may be rendered unnecessary through the application of sufficient pressure to encourage confessions from the various participants in the conspiracy." He paused and then added, with characteristic understatement, "The matter has possessed a certain intellectual interest, I confess, though I cannot say that the psychological configuration of the perpetrators has been particularly illuminating. One encounters, in the commission of crimes, a certain predictability regarding human motivation and human weakness, greed, certainly, and the desire for self-aggrandizement, but also the peculiar species of desperation that attends upon the recognition of one's own inadequacy in the face of adverse circumstance. Mr. Robert Cairncross was, in the final analysis, merely a desperate man employing the only resources available to him, his intelligence, and his lack of moral restraint, in an attempt to secure for himself the financial position that he believed to be his due. That this attempt has resulted in his destruction rather than his salvation is merely the ordinary operation of that particular species of justice which the criminal endeavors to evade.